Okay. Great. So we are live on the first machine medicine interview series. I'm delighted to have Amandeep Singh with us here to talk about AI startups and pharma and how they should and should not try and scale. I guess just to say a little bit of context, I am in my sort of role as CEO of Machine Medicine, make a point of reading around the pharmaceutical industry and trying to get insights into how a startup such as our own company, Machine Medicine, should address the industry, and came across Anandip's article, and it struck me as sort of unusual in that it rather than sort of kowtowing to the hype and having a lot of mumbo jumbo about how transformation of the whole industry was hours away, maybe even minutes. It made some serious sort of points about pretty classic mistakes that seem to be made again and again and again. And I think sort of mistakes that certainly we were making at the beginning of machine medicine, and I guess I feel we've learned the hard way, and perhaps there's a little bit of regret that I didn't have this article at the beginning of my journey. I might have cut a few corners that I didn't really have to go around. So I think with that sort of background in mind, I'll give you over to you, Amandeep, for a few minutes if you want to just give us a sort of a bit of an insight into sort of where you've come from and what you do now and what your ambitions are for the future. It'd be great to hear about you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for inviting me over here. So definitely, AI is an exciting area. It's moved beyond the buzzword right now, and it's actually making an impact in healthcare and pharma. So I did my PhD from Indian Institute of Science in drug discovery, and I did it through traditional methods. And I moved out to the CRO space to act as a drug discovery scientist for other pharma companies and provide services. But during that time, Google's algorithm predicted a structure of protein, 3D structure of the protein very, very accurately. And in 2019 itself, there were quite a number of landmark studies in terms of pharma, where deep genomics came up with a new target for Wilson's disease and also a therapy through AI, as well as Exscientia, which is also another startup based out of UK, came up with a bispecific molecule and delivered it to GSK, one of the biggest pharmas. So I thought it was time to now, when the fruits have started to, bear, and I should just dive deep. And I moved back to India with a consulting group I've previously known and interned and freelance with. And we started diving deep into the journey of AI healthcare startups, first starting with drug discovery, then moving towards digital health and so forth. So that's my journey into AI. And I have great hopes with the AI, and the integration of IoT with AI is something that I look forward to.
Right.
So
right.
As I think occasionally I mentioned to my girlfriend that, imagine a future 10 years later where you'll be standing in front of the mirror brushing your teeth, and the mirror will take your blood pressure and glucose measurements and just send it notification to your phone. And as you walk out of the washroom, Alexa will shout out that here are some supplements that would be great for you. Shall I order it ahead? So I think it's a bright future ahead with AI, and specifically with the neural networks now.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. So I guess a basic question that one might ask is, why does if AI is such an amazing tool, why doesn't Big Pharma do this itself? Why do startups have to do this? Have you got any sort of feel for?
Right. So Big Pharma is a very niche kind of a industry. They are very hesitant to outsiders to change in conventional techniques, to accept. So even when new high throughput techniques came in, like HCS, where you could screen billions of compounds virtually at a very high speed, it took about 4 to 5 years for pharma to accept that. And AI, from its initial cases, Merck, which is one of the big pharmas, partnered with uh, a startup, which I will not name, but somehow it did not yield any results until the end of 4 years. And there were quite a number of cases where early partnerships didn't yield any result. And we now know that, AI is garbage in, garbage out. You don't feed in the right data, you don't feed in the right amount of data, the insights that you're going to get are not going to be good. So
okay, so I think you actually,
gradually,
there's a phrase there that I think comes from your article. Actually, garbage in, garbage out. It was true
right.
for AI, as you said. So it actually brings us on to your first kind of major point of those five. So I just read it to living in a technology bubble and failing to understand the language of pharma. This is the first kind of sort of pitfall that you identify. So do you want to just sort of try and flesh out what you mean by that?
So a lot of these AI startups have been, inculcated and incubated by people who are knee deep in tech. They are great with algorithms. They are great with front end engineering and everything. But what they fail to understand is that biology and pharma and drug discovery inherently is a very, very complex mechanism. One disease is contributed through multiple networks of proteins, and if you don't feed in the right data sets, so if you look at predatory journals, they would publish anything and everything for you. You look at uh, publications and gene data sets from small universities, they are not even replicable. A lot of times these VCs have to spend about 20 to 30 million dollars just before they can verify the idea and start towards the drug discovery program. So it is inherently important to understand how pharma, healthcare, what kind of aspects are crucial to understand, what kind of data sets are crucial to understand, how the value chain look like. So if you don't understand that, eventually you build a technology that does not cater to anything. You only consider or address one aspect of the whole value chain while neglecting the rest of the value chain. Eventually there is no link from the previous set of experiments to the next set of process.
So
So I'll
it was
give
a
you
sort
an
of
example here. It's how, so I'll not name the startup again. It's a startup which had about $50 million in funding. And they were in one of the developing countries. So their burn rate was much less than in the Western countries. They started as a diagnostics company, AI-based diagnostics company, developing algorithms for urine, semen, and blood analysis, smear analysis. They eventually realized that they need a special microscope which will be able to read and give the quality of images they want. So they ventured into now making the microscope and making the camera which can capture. They deployed a few of these instruments in some of the diagnostic chains, and eventually the technicians who were making those blood smears, the slides which were to be analyzed by this, were not doing it perfectly. So then they went ahead, raised more funds, opened their own diagnostic chains, trained the algorithms, trained the technicians, and eventually this was not planned out. So they realized after 8 years of development that the whole diagnostic system is pretty broken, and they can't just fix one portion of the value chain and realize that that we have revolutionized the way diagnostic is done. So they kept on burning cash and cash from being just a data driven company to becoming a whole diagnostics chain. This was not the original aim of the company. And some of the founders left and there was a conflict. So it is very uh, important that you understand the whole system from the very beginning, how things work in the diagnostic industry or the pharma industry or the healthcare
okay.
industry, and then start addressing the aspects holistically.
But just to address your anecdote, did the company fail ultimately or succeed?
So they recently, due to COVID, they had to shut down a lot of things, and they are now revamping and revisiting themselves as a tech company rather than a diagnostic chain.
Right. Okay. Sounds like a lot of back and forth.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we've touched on a little bit on the error of, as you say, prioritizing technology over business strategy. I think you said a bit about how important it is to understand the incentives and motivations from a business perspective of the decision makers in particular inside the industry. And I guess that's something that we see in many sectors. So it's kind of, I guess it's
Right.
startup 101 stuff, right? The most
Right.
common reason for startups to fail is that there's no desire for their product, or it's not solving a real problem.
Eventually, you
Okay.
have to realize that payers have to pay for it. You can't keep on building it assuming that somebody will adopt it and distribute it. The payers will have to pay for the technology. If they're not ready for it, then I guess you shouldn't go ahead.
You might be too early. Great. Okay. So the third point that you identify is getting stuck in a never-ending development loop. Yeah. Do you want to say a little bit more about why is this? Is this something again? Is this particular to pharma, or is this a general problem with startups? Do you think? Is it the regulatory burden? What makes this a particular problem for companies that are focused on the pharmaceutical sector?
So I think within pharma, as you would realize, we are now convoluting towards neural networks. Some of them generative, some of them convolution based, and with advent of new algorithms from universities and publications, everybody tries to keep on improving the weights and the number of nodes in the network that you're trying to create. And this is a very difficult process, because each time you change something in the algorithm, you have to revisit it and revamp it, looking at the result. And as you know, data scientists don't come cheap. They charge you a lot of money. Then the amount of time that you spend developing and optimizing these algorithms on and on and on to achieve an efficacy of, say, 90% from 85%, covering those last 5% takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of optimization. We have to understand whether or not that 5% is critical or not. If we get good enough with that 85%, should we just stop? Are we better than what is available, or should we just keep on going until we achieve, say, 95% or better efficacy than that? So
Yeah.
that decision of stopping the development when it's appropriate and applicable right away should be critical to a startup.
Yeah, it is something I think that we've seen as well in our own company, that actually there was a lot of low hanging fruit that a lot of problems that we could solve with relatively straightforward approaches, without having to do anything too fancy. And it's probably a good idea to get that stuff right first, I guess. Right.
Right. So
before you
so let's dive deep on that. So when you already plucked the low hanging fruits, what was your immediate instinct? You wanted to go for the higher fruits?
No, I think that one of the things we realized was that one of the things that we do is a sort of a computer vision based motor assessment, and so I guess an obvious application might be, and people have many times said to us, do you intend to replace neurologists? And it's conceivable application, but it's not really that useful. I mean, neurologists do a fairly good job of assessing patients, and they do all sorts of other things as well, like talk to the patients about their family situation, or assess their mood and so forth. So I think what we realized is that actually the place where that sort of assessment can be valuable now, and has a much lower kind of regulatory requirement, is in quality control, so that we're able to check that motor assessments have been done well, rather than claiming to sort of replace anybody. So that it means that the bar you're aiming for is lower, and so you don't have to get so high in order to meet it in terms of performance. So that was an important lesson for us that wasn't immediately obvious, and I guess that a sort of illustration of what you're saying. But I think one thing that made me think about more generally was that when sort of AI engineers or engineers of any sort really come into medicine, I think especially sort of from a sort of supervised learning perspective, they look for the supervised learning problems. Like, and so, for example, diagnosis is something that's often people, maybe we can do diagnosis algorithmically, and it's a very natural thought for an engineer or a data scientist. But if you went and asked doctors, what's the most annoying problem you have every day, I think very few of them would say diagnosing their patients. I mean, I think they would even say that's the part they really enjoy. That's why they still do it.
Right.
That's why they put up with all the nonsense and the admin, and that aspect of it is part of it they really enjoy. And if you look at something like Parkinson's disease, where we work, the diagnosis is a fairly small part of a patient's overall sort of journey from becoming unwell to getting diagnosed to getting treated, and then all the neurodegenerative conditions. So it's tempting to come into pharma or come into medicine more generally and look for the machine learning problems. So, right, there's a machine learning problem. That problem is ideally suited to machine learning. Therefore, we will establish a company around solving that problem. When I guess what you're saying, and I think what I learned slowly, was that you should come into the business and say, what problems are these guys facing, and which are the most valuable ones, and of those, which can I solve better than anyone else? Perhaps something more like that.
Right. That's fairly well put, I would say. So again, diverging a little bit from taking cues from your conversation. So how do you think that this kind of diagnostic algorithms would come into future? They would definitely reduce the time that neurologist takes to diagnose a patient, because they would have early assessment, and this would definitely ease a little bit burden on their timetables and schedules. But what next from there?
Yeah, I'm not even sure it would sort of ease their sort of timetables that much. I mean, there are some areas where there definitely is an excessive sort of workload of examinations that it looks plausible. So there's some radiology startups that I know that are trying to sort of build systems that will help speed up at least breast screening, examination of CTs for breast cancer screening. So there are some cases, but I think generally the stuff that causes the gums up and slows down sort of the clinical machine, as it were, is generally pretty mundane stuff like record keeping, and certainly as a clinician myself, that was the part that I hated. I'd spend 30% of my time in front of a computer, generally making medical records. Often from handwritten notes that have been made at the bedside, then you then have to transfer onto an EHR of some description. So I think a lot of this stuff is incredibly kind of like mundane, but super important, because it's the stuff that bungs up and gums up the cogs of sort of good clinical practice.
Okay, so
yeah, but one thing I would say where I think it has real potential, and I think where we've tried to focus is in not kind of, again, not replacing clinicians, but by providing a scalable source of clinical information. So at the moment, the clinical information gathering is highly episodic, and it generally only happens when a patient is interacting with a clinician, and I guess some of these systems, certainly what we're building and what many other people are building, and the whole kind of IoT revolution opens up the prospect of scalable data capture.
Right. I think real world evidence is the way forward. Definitely looking at how things are spanning up with COVID, where therapies were approved, diagnostics were approved from a very small data set, and then moved into a post-marketing surveillance is I think great. I think gathering data should be one of the key ways to go ahead whenever you're building a AI healthcare startup as well.
Yeah, I'm sure that's probably true. And the other place where it seems to be there seems to be sort of convergent forces is in the movement in the sort of the shift to value-based reimbursement. So actually, the actual sort of the outcome-based reimbursement, how good the improvement in, say, quality of life is in the patient, rather than the procedure-based fee-based system where how expensive is the surgery, or how much does the surgeon want to charge, based sort of model. So that and the ability to capture a scalable clinical assessment, i.e., to be able to monitor how well a person is living, not just how well they behave or seem in the doctor's office, is those two forces seem to be concurrent. So that's sort of interesting. So how do you kind of when you work with startups, are you typically, you say in your article that you often work with startups, but do you work with some big corporates as well? It seems like you have in the past. So where do you think the sort of interesting place for you going forward is, and what problems are you going to be focusing on?
I think I'm pretty confident that the place where we are at the interface of big pharma and startups. Coming from a immediately new background, I don't have too much of industry experience, so I understand startup grit, that grit to do everything, that need to understand everything, that approach to aggressively go ahead and challenge the old ways. But at the same time, my firm has been working with big pharmas. At least you can name at least of the top 10, we would have worked with the top 6 to 8 companies across the world, and at least transacted with others. So being at the interface is very important, because we're able to bridge the gap between what the expectations in the big pharma are, because the reluctance in the big pharma still exists. They have a typical way to approach a problem, they have a typical way to approach a new technology, and typical way to mark or assess the progress of new technologies, which is not very relevant to AI companies, because the kind of progress you make with AI platforms, sometimes no results might be visible until the 90th percentile. And all of a sudden, in the last 10 percentile of the time, results which are better than conventional techniques may appear. So I think being at the interface of startups as well as big pharma is pretty exciting.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I was wondering, you mentioned in your article that I think you largely focus on companies that are dealing with drug discovery, AI assisted drug discovery, and I guess it's just important to note that there are all kinds of other sort of issues like patient recruitment and trial design, all sorts of other areas that people are working in. But that's the one you focus on. You have a strong sort of scientific background that's relevant to it, I guess. So you mentioned there's been a lot of these companies that have been at least sort of set up and funded, but only a handful of them have managed to actually achieve real traction with pharma. What do you think the main differentiator is with those companies? Are they not perpetrating your 5 pitfalls? What's the difference between those guys? Do they have pharma executives as well as AI experts at sort of leading the organization, or are there any sort of any particular sort of features that leap out to you?
So, as a benchmark within our own assessments, we have kept the ratio of AI versus biology experts as a marker to understand how well is the firm, set in its core. How well do they understand the business by themselves. Another key thing that we look when we are looking at startups is the consideration how often and how early are they partnering with academic labs. Academic labs are repository of unstructured data. Universities have plethora of data that they are willing to share in open source. And now there are a lot of benchmarking data sets, lots of free data sets that are available. And some of the data sets are even purchasable at a very small cost. So what we, advise to startups, or in fact, we look at startups, is how early did they start reaching out to the market? How, whether it's the academic labs, whether it's the industry, the big pharma, or CROs. In fact, CROs, I think, give a great win-win situation to startups. You partner with a clinical research organization or a contract research organization. You offer them your platform. They can learn AI. They can start implementing AI for their projects, their clients' projects, and from them you can get a proof of concept validation in wet labs, in experiments, that whether the predictions your algorithms made are actually right or not. So that becomes a win-win feedback loop, that you keep on, both the parties keep getting benefits, and you don't have to spend too much money up front.
That's great. I think that's a great piece of advice. So what would you recommend to, say we've got a young computer scientist, deep learning expert coming out of his PhD, and he knows a lot about AI and maybe even a lot about computational chemistry and drug discovery. He's mad keen to start his startup. What would you recommend? What's his first step? What should he do? Should he team up? Should he go it alone? What should he do?
Definitely team up. Find a pharma executive or a healthcare person with at least 5 to 10 years of experience, knee deep, and make him a partner in the company, because that would be crucial to understand what to address. And as it's become pretty evident, if you're a chemist and you have a computational background, go for generative adversarial networks. Try and create feedback networks, validation networks, testing networks, and generative networks in comprehension, where they all these networks work together and you identify new drugs, because that is the way to go. At least we have 2,700 FDA approved drugs, or so, such an odd number, and at least we have more than about 2,000 to 3,000 targets which have been identified as drug targets or have some association with diseases. It's a vast area. Go ahead, jump in. There's a lot to achieve. Still a lot of low-hanging fruits out. Go ahead.
Would you say, in terms of sort of disease types or sort of particular sectors, would you say there are sectors that are moving ahead faster than others? It seems like a lot of companies are focused on oncology just because of the size of the market.
I think there's a resonance. You start doing what the market is, expecting you to. You can't keep on addressing some questions or some diseases which have, say, a total market size of 3 million, 5 million. By the time you finish developing, and eventually those patient pool will eventually narrow down once you start. If it's a curative therapy, then it will start narrowing down. But I think as we move forward, leave apart drug discovery as a niche where I currently focus. My rest of the team also focuses on digital health and a broader sector of AI. What particularly excites me is real world evidence and AI from real world evidence. Build NLP algorithms and gather all the data publicly available, get good insights, and reach out to pharma companies. Say, hey, this is your drug. It's been used for X disease and see X many papers. And I think this is the mechanism which it works on. Would you guys like to try it? I think there's a lot of potential in repurposing as well. And NLP algorithms are one of the key factors that would be required to build those knowledge graphs.
Very interesting. So if our sort of a young protagonist who's starting his company wants to team up with executives, I haven't met many executives that are fairly high up the greasy pole in Pfizer or Merck, and that are willing to jump ship and join a startup. Do you think does this pool of expertise exist that's willing to collaborate with technologists to create the right blend of domain and technical expertise?
I think it's a great question. So, as I told you, that last year was a milestone year, the proof of concept year for AI drug discovery. Now, a lot of veterans would be willing to jump in for such companies. But another great way is to have good advisors on your board, to have advisors from such companies like Merck, Novartis, or the big ones, the big 10 pharma, who have deep roots of networks as well as a deep, rich experience, who can get you that visibility as well as give you guidance enough. Early on your journey, have advisors from different geographies, different domains, and with different kind of background experiences. One from BD, one from research, one from marketing, or some other aspect.
Cool, great. All right. Well, I think we've about reached the end of our time, Amandeep, unfortunately. But look, there's some great advice in there, both positive and negative, in the sense of what you might not want to do or what you shouldn't do, and also some good suggestions about positive sort of actions that people can take in order to maximize the fairly shabby chances of success in the startup world. So yeah, thanks so much for your time. I plan to stay in touch, and perhaps we'll have you back in a 6 months or a year or something to see what's evolved in the interim, and see where we both are, and just how wrong I was about some things, and maybe how right you were about others, or who knows, vice versa.
Definitely.
So,
it was a great conversation, Jonathan. Thank you so
likewise.
much for inviting me, and
Cheers.
thank you for reaching out.
Brilliant. All the best, and
thank you.
Catch up soon. Bye now.
Bye-bye.